Very special interactive session. We have Ambassador Anil Wadhwa in conversation with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. I'm sure Dr. Shashi Tharoor does not need any introduction, but yet for the sake of this session, Dr. Shashi Tharoor is a member of Parliament for Lok Sabha. He's a former career international diplomat. He has served as the chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs and All India Professionals Congress. He is an acclaimed writer, having authored 18 best-selling works of fiction and non-fiction, and hundreds of articles and columns for prominent publications. We welcome you, sir. Now we hand over the mic to you for your interactive session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will now begin this session, which is on foreign policy, and essentially it is a conversation, but I will now begin by, first of all, asking Dr. Shashi Tharoor about what his impressions have been on the first Modi government as far as the achievements are concerned. How would he evaluate that? And after that, what are the expectations as the Indians see this in terms of Modi 2.0, which is our topic for today? And where does he see Indian foreign policy going?
Well, Anil, I won't pretend to be objective. I'm a member of the opposition, and we look with a critical eye on how things have gone in the last few years. I think we'll certainly recognize that Mr. Modi has brought a lot of personal energy into the conduct of foreign policy. He has traveled extensively and tirelessly, and there's a lot of that personal commitment to getting India seen and noticed around the world. That's on the plus side. And if there were one more thing on the plus side, it would probably be some of the soft power initiatives, International Day of Yoga, the International Buddhist Conference. I'm surprised there's been no follow-up on that. One or two of these things which have tried to project India's, shall we say, soft power to the outside world. On the flip side, however, I think we're doing pretty disastrously in the neighborhood, in the sense that if you look at where Mr. Modi inherited relations, at the beginning of his tenure and at the end of his first term, there was a terrible setback in the relationship with Nepal, which is entirely a result of his party's desire to cultivate a certain element in Nepal at the expense of the bilateral relationship. There was a setback in the relationship with Sri Lanka, and in the Maldives, we had got to a point before the last elections last year, we had got to a point where the Maldives was even advertising in the papers job vacancies in their country saying Indian nationals need not apply. So things had got pretty bad. Again, on the plus side of the ledger, you did have the willingness of Mr. Modi to conclude the bilateral constitutional amendment agreement between us and Bangladesh to settle the border, which UPA had concluded, but which the BJP had objected to earlier. But this time they agreed to do that, and that was certainly a positive. Secondly, I suppose one could look objectively at how can I put it, the orientation of India towards bilateral and multilateral cooperation. And there's some positives. They attempt to get BBIN off the ground, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal, in order to compensate for the fact that Pakistan was essentially stymieing SAARC through its objections to any initiative. And now BIMSTEC has been raised on the same basis. Pakistan itself, however, has been a very puzzling policy. It has been extremely unclear from the start what exactly Mr. Modi's vision was. He campaigned in 2014 against relations with Pakistan, attacked Congress party for giving chicken biryani to Pakistani leaders, and then to our astonishment, he called Mr. Nawaz Sharif for his inauguration, though he didn't specify whether he'd serve him chicken biryani or not. Then there was a sentimental exchange of saris and shawls with each other's mothers. That was already in May, but by July, there was already heavy artillery exchanges across the border. In September, you had the SAARC in Kathmandu, where Mr. Modi ostentatiously ignores Mr. Nawaz Sharif as he walks to the podium by reading a brochure when Mr. Nawaz is going past him. But then it turns out a few weeks later that they had actually met privately in an Indian businessman's hotel room. So there's been completely missed signals. You know, you announced talks between the foreign secretaries, Then you call off the talks at the last minute because the Pakistanis do something they'd always done, which is talk to Hurriyat. And then when you makes it very clear, if you indulge the Hurriyat, they're not going to talk to you, then suddenly 3 weeks later, the news emerges the national security advisors have met in Bangkok. Now, this is all just the first 6 months of Mr. Modi, and it continues like that. You have setback after setback, attacks on Indian bases, suddenly this whimsical, impulsive decision to go at absurdly short notice to Nawaz Sharif's birthday celebration and his granddaughter's wedding, which was decided so spontaneously and on such a whim that the Indian ambassador in Islamabad didn't have time to get to Lahore airport to receive his own prime minister. Now, you can't do foreign policy that way. I mean, you've been in the business all your working life. You know that things have to be planned and structured in a certain way. And Mr. Modi himself had taken the line when we were in power that absolutely no concessions to Pakistan, least of all a visit to Pakistan, until Pakistan shows us satisfaction in proceeding against the perpetrators of 2611 or other concrete actions against terrorists. No concrete action had happened, and yet Mr. Modi made this impulsive gesture. And then what happens? He comes back, and within 2-3 weeks, there's the attack on Pathankot. And in a fit of naivete, he invites the ISI to send people to look at the airbase themselves. Now, these things are simply not done. It really will raise some very, very serious concerns on all our parts. And of course, predictably, the Pakistanis take a good look at our facilities, which we have not been able to see of theirs. And then they go back to Pakistan and say, oh, it was a false flag operation. The Indians did it to themselves. So that shows the utter naivete of our approach. And I must say, throughout all this, there's been a complete lack of a coherent explanation to the nation or to Parliament as to what the vision is. Are we trying to pursue peace because we can't afford to live with a hostile Pakistan? Are we trying to take a hard line on terrorism? Are we trying to take a trade orientation, improving the relation with... Nothing is clear. We are all over the place. There are more ups and downs with Pakistan than a child's yo-yo. And I just don't know at the end of the day whether they have any more coherent idea today of what they wish to do. The Pulwama attack was essentially a major intelligence failure on our part. The Balakot strike sent a very powerful signal, though it's very debatable whether it actually did any real damage on the other side, but at least the willingness to show that we will take action may have sobered some people on the other side. That's about it on the neighborhood. On the global level, I think we have 3 sets of problems created for us by our friends in Washington. There is a tension between US and Russia. There is a tension between US and China. And there is a tension between US and Iran. And all 3 of them affect us. In one way or the other, we are going to have to adjust to the reality of Iran already. The American sanctions on Iran, we are going to go from 23.5 million barrels of crude right down to 0 within a 1.5 year span. If you look at China, we have tried to walk a very delicate tightrope between the American desire that one should counterbalance China and resist it, and the Indian desire that while we have no illusions about Chinese motives, we are at the same time very anxious to have a viable working relationship with them. And then finally, you've got the US-Russia tensions, which have complicated our attitude to Russia. The Russians seem to think that we have become too friendly to the US in this particular equation. And as you know, last year they conducted the extraordinary act of conducting military exercises with the Pakistani army in POK. Starting off their exercise in POK, which is an unmistakable signal to us that we can't take the Russians for granted anymore. So given all of this, I would say that on the whole, the report card of the Modi government's first term would be B- or a C+, nothing better. And there's a long way to go to improve all of this. Meanwhile, there are some real trade challenges. The US approach to China is, of course, very much dictated by the trade war brewing between them. And we'll have to see what we can do about finding our own space. And as far as trade is concerned, have we got a policy on what to do after the Trans-Pacific Partnership collapsed? Are we interested in joining the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership? We have never been particularly good at trade negotiations and trade relationships because our governments have tended to be, frankly, led by the bureaucracy and all this, and our bureaucracy has been very process-oriented without a larger vision as to what India's trade place should be in the global economy. Has the Modi government got a new vision? No clue. Absolutely none whatsoever. And then I suppose the final angle that we do need to touch upon is the question of the Foreign Service. You've served there for a long time. You know its strengths and they're outstanding. But the Indian diplomatic corps has been starved of resources for far too long. The size of our professional diplomacy, that is the main IFS, is comparable in size to that of Singapore and New Zealand. Now, whenever you ask the MEA, they'll give you the numbers of all the IFSB clerks and attaches to bring up a larger total. But even that total is well smaller than Brazil, let alone China. And of course, you can't even compare with the US because we have 880 and the US has 20,000. So you're looking at a situation in which the government has to decide whether it wants to starve the Foreign Service and the MEA or whether it wants to give it the priority and the resources that the government's, what's the word I want there? They're rather overweening ambitions on the global stage. But the RSS talking about Bharat being a Vishwa Guru and so on. Where are the resources commensurate with that sort of ambition? In defense, we are still the second largest importer of defense supplies in the world. When are we going to see an indigenous defense industry growing in a way that can be taken seriously? We thought in Mr. Modi's first term he was going to open up the defense space to the private sector, engage the Indian business community in producing defense material, producing what we could have become a defense exporter in the neighborhood and a net provider of security to our insecure neighbors, instead of which we are busy buying foreign arms because even the Indian military doesn't think that our DRDO's products are particularly desirable or worth having. So on the whole, the challenges are enormous. I think these are the principal ones that I would identify. And I have not been encouraged by the kinds of steps taken in the first term. I'll end by saying, however, that Jaishankar is a very interesting, intriguing choice as foreign minister. He is a smart man. He thinks, he understands the ministry inside out, and he understands the relationship with both the US and China, having served there as ambassador. So let us see if he is able to persuade the Prime Minister to do more than just a day-to-day management of world relations, but actually come up with a comprehensive vision statement that can take Indians along in the adventure of what India should be all about on the world stage.
Well, thank you very much for outlining all those issues for us. I think it's a tough situation as far as India is concerned because we have a number of problems which have cropped up. As you mentioned, United States, Russia, and of course, China has always been a bit of a challenge for us. The challenge of what we do as far as Pakistan is concerned, what we do in our neighborhood, they're all big issues which the government will have to confront in Modi 2.0. But one particular issue I wanted to touch upon, ask you about this, is that India is with Russia and China on the one hand in a grouping, and we are also with a grouping which has Japan and the United States on the other. And it's something which always is very intriguing for people, how it is able to manage to be on these two groupings and at the same time maintain good relationships with all of them. It's also like maintaining a good relationship with Saudi Arabia, with Israel, with Iran at the same time. And would you consider that a plus as far as Modi's foreign policy is concerned in the past and even in the current circumstances? And going forward, you think that this can sustain itself?
Yes, but I would say that's really India's accomplishment in the sense that there's no break in continuity with the approach of the previous governments. Whether the UPA government or before that Vajpayee's government, our orientation was broadly the same. And the Modi government has wisely continued that orientation. I wouldn't say it's been a rupture. As far as the RIC is concerned, that was set up during UPA, the Russia, India, China trilateral. In fact, I would argue even further, Anil, that what we're looking at today, and I'm sure that you as a dyed-in-the-wool Foreign Service veteran will not be happy to hear me say this, is that we moved away from non-alignment to multi-alignment. We are now aligned in all sorts of directions, and the metaphor I would use is that of the internet, the World Wide Web. We're all connected on different networks to different people. And I may be connected to him and he may be connected to her, but I may not be connected to her because in each case there is a certain transaction element We have something to gain from this relationship or this connection, and we have something to contribute to this connection that makes us a desirable partner, but we don't necessarily have that same sort of relationship with the third person, whereas the two of you might do. So to take an example of this, Rick, you mentioned the Russia, India, Chinese trilateral. We also add the Brazilians and the South Africans, and we get BRICS. Then we subtract the Russians and the Chinese, and we get IPSA for South-South collaboration. And then we add the Chinese but not the Russians, and we get BASIC for environmental negotiations. And it's amusing that we are the only country that's in all these four groupings because we have something to contribute, not merely because our name happens to begin with that most useful element in every acronym, a vowel, but because you can't pronounce any of these things without India being in it. RIC, BRICS, IPSA, and BASIC all require that I, so they can't do without us. But jokes apart, it's also true that we have a contribution to make and we gain something from this forum. When it comes to this Japan, US, India thing, which is relatively new, I might add that it's still a little uncertain. For example, the Modi government appeared to be flirting with the idea of the Quad, which would be Japan, US, India, and Australia. Then what happened? Having announced a meeting, they suddenly conducted at a very low level, lower than the others had expected. They sent a JS level person to have meetings. There is no joint communique issued, but 4 different communiques, each of which indicates very clear differences of opinion. Then we don't hear about the Quad anymore, and suddenly this juicy, or whatever you call it, Japan, US, India combination starts coming up. Again, clarity to my mind is a bit lacking. If we can manage to pull it off, in the sense that we keep good links with both sets of people, that will be great. But RIC, I think the Russians and the Chinese would feel that RIC has never really fulfilled its potential. In fact, sometimes there have been moments when our foreign ministers found it difficult to find them a time and a date for a trilateral meeting. And they had hoped for a little more convergence of orientations at the global level, whereas we, of course, had reasons to hesitate, given the damage it could have done to our relationship with the US. So meanwhile, the R and the C are getting closer to each other, the Russians and the Chinese. But we, as Indians, I'm not quite sure how much of a significant player we are anymore in RIC, and whether we have more or less decided that appeasing the US, with its rather temperamental and unpredictable president, is more important for us than this relationship.
So I come back to the question of Iran. And as you know, you yourself pointed out that we've reduced our oil imports from Iran to zero, almost zero. And this is a leverage which is no longer available to us. And we also have very important stakes in Chabahar, because that would have opened up the route into Central Asia for us, bypassing Pakistan. Which
well, I
seems to
believe
be
Chabahar is exempt from sanctions.
yes,
so far.
but going forward, I think whenever we have need for finances, the banks would find it very difficult to go in for loans and also to lend money to companies which are going to work in Chabahar. So in practical terms, it becomes much more difficult. But my point is that with all this in the current scenario, have we lost a leverage as far as Iran is concerned? And was it a mistake to actually reduce our oil purchases from Iran, where the Chinese have been able to maintain it?
China has entered a different league from us, and I think we have to be very honest about this. The Chinese can resist the Americans, and so far have done so, though we'll see what implications it has for the trade war. Whereas we have felt, I think, that our options are somewhat less substantial, and we have tended to bow a little bit to the Americans. I think the Japanese have also bowed a bit to the Americans on this. Of the three of us, China, and we're all dependent heavily on Iranian oil, the Chinese are the only ones who refuse to bend. But having said that, it's also true that the leverage that you're talking about with Iran, we've never used. For example, when the whole nuclear deal negotiations being conducted by the Obama administration, they were partners were Europeans, whereas we one of the very few countries that had good relations with both the US and Iran at that time. Did we take any advantage of it to become an influential player? No, we didn't. We essentially left it to the Western countries to deal with that. So how are we can talk about leverage, but how do we use that leverage? I don't think we actually did anything very much with that leverage. We had good relations with Iran. We talked about civilizational connections. we welcome students, all of that stuff. But in practical terms, what did we do with that Iran relationship that we, minus oil, can't continue doing? Minus oil, of course, is a big minus, but that's something the government has presumably taken a call on after examining all the options.
So let's talk about the future of Afghanistan. And as you know, India has put in a lot of money into reconstruction of Afghanistan, invested a lot in this relationship. But we find ourselves in a situation where the United States is now talking to the Taliban and trying to find an exit out of Afghanistan, which in effect means that the legitimate government in Afghanistan is not really involved in these talks. Now, in this current scenario, our stand has been that the government of Afghanistan must be involved, and therefore we have not had anything to do with the Taliban. If you were making a policy decision, what would be your reaction to this? Would you start a dialogue with Taliban on the side and hope that even if there is a compromise which is reached in the end, that you maintain some sort of relationship with the new government, or the stand that Indian government has taken so far, which is to say that we will only deal with the legitimate government in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, on this one I have some sympathy for the existing Indian stand, because the Taliban, let's not forget, are the very people who were involved in the Kandahar hijack in '99, which resulted in the deaths of Indian citizens. They were unremittingly hostile to us throughout their time when they were running the so-called Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. I don't really think we can find common ground. Their entire reason for existence is based on such hostility to non-Muslim states, and particularly one in the neighborhood. That Taliban coming to power is undoubtedly bad news for us, and I think we will have to resist it, and we'll have to return to the days when we were making common cause with Iran to finance Ahmad Shah Massoud and arm him and help him and so on, and people like that. We'll have to find a new Massoud. But before we get to that, there is a middle path which I don't know whether Indian diplomacy is in a position to explore, which is to try and split the Taliban. If we can get part of the Taliban to agree to contest in the elections in Afghanistan, which are due in the next few months, you may actually get a legitimate political expression of those views. It's like encouraging the Hurriyat to run in elections in Kashmir. So you get the separatist elements back into the political mainstream. If you can do that, then you can isolate the rejectionist sections of Taliban, the ones who are totally fanatic in killing, and buy into those who are prepared to participate in the process. And then, of course, whatever votes they win adds to their legitimacy. Right now, they have no legitimacy other than their guns and their bombs. So that could be a thing. But of course, we have good relations with Ashraf Ghani and his government. We have pretty decent relations with the US, which is the big power behind the throne. Surely this is an angle we could have well explored with both those parties. We can't lead on that because the Taliban doesn't particularly like us. But if we could say that we would lend our good office, this is a formula that has worked in India for many separatist movements. We have tried to bring armed people, whether it's the Mizos, whether it's the Nagas, whether it's the Khalistanis, but we've tried to bring all those who are prepared to participate in the democratic process and seek to legitimize themselves that way. We've tried to bring them into the system. And by and large, that's diffused most of our conflicts in the last 50, 60 years. So it's certainly something the Afghans could try. But not the whole Taliban, unelected body armed to the teeth that's killing people and blowing up the Indian, or trying to blow up the Indian embassy in Kabul and so on. That lot we can't possibly entertain. What we have to do is try and split them by getting some of those, the ones who are considered the more reasonable people talking to Zalmay Khalilzad and so on, ask them to come and contest the elections to prove their own popularity. Whether they have the courage to do it, I don't know. I mean, there are many Kashmiris, for example, who would participate in the process where they're not afraid of the militants killing them for participating. So that may be an inhibition, but I don't have any evidence that it's ever been tried.
So we'll talk now about the United Nations and India's desire to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, something which you know a lot about since you've served in the United Nations. This process has been some time now, and India has been trying extremely hard in collaboration with the G4, for example, lately. The process is not going anywhere. It's actually stuck. In fact, it's regressing, and there seems to be very little hope in the near term that this issue will progress any further. What should India do in this situation? What would be your solution to this, or your advice about how India should proceed in this matter in the United Nations?
Well, personally, I share completely the diagnosis that that the world cannot afford to have an organization like the Security Council, the premier body for peace and security in the world's leading international organization, reflecting the realities, the geopolitical realities of 1945, rather than the realities of 2020. So clearly there is a problem with the council continuing like this. What I would have been more inclined to do, and the Modi government has not done this, is to take the upcoming 75th anniversary of the UN, which is next year, and ask for a mass dialogue on the future of the UN. I mean, one of the questions that I have as a UN, passionately committed UN man, is that if the body continues to be anchored in events of 3/4 of a century ago, how will it be relevant to any of the crises of tomorrow? I mean, to be very honest, if there is a major sanctions imposed on a subcontinental state, for whatever reason, that we have not agreed with or we've not been consulted on, I can see India refusing to cooperate in those sanctions. The same would apply if the same thing was tried in say, Southern Africa with South Africa not consulted, or in Northern or Western Africa with Nigeria not consulted. I mean, there are many countries which have the capacity to essentially defy the international community, because sanctions are not enforceable through boots on the ground or cameras in the air or whatever. They're enforceable essentially by the moral authority of the international system and the clout of those who are trying to impose it. Now, when our own interests are indirectly affected, say as with Iran, we have given in. But if tomorrow they come and sanction Nepal or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or even Pakistan, we may think twice. I mean, Pakistan is, of course, a rare example, because we're de facto not doing much with them anyway on the trade front. But the moral authority of the Security Council depends on the legitimacy of its representativeness. And if instead it's a body where everyone says, you know, why are the Brits and the French there, the Germans and Japanese and Indians are not there, then the credibility will go when those people start deciding on decisions that affect the well-being of other people around the world. So there is a problem. The other thing is, generally speaking on international affairs, India has taken the position that that we will only participate, for example, in peacekeeping operations approved by the United Nations Security Council. The logic is the United Nations Security Council is a body with international legitimacy. How long are we going to keep on saying that? We keep getting excluded and there's no progress being made. I remember being at the UN when Boutros Ghali, who was Secretary General in 1992, declared that he would want to see Security Council reform being completed in time for the 50th anniversary of the UN in 1995. The 50th has come and gone, 60th has come and gone, 70th has come and gone. We're facing 75th anniversary next year. How on earth can the credibility of the organization extend to sustaining this indefinite delay in any meaningful institutional reform? Something has to be done, or otherwise there's a real worry that the authority of the Council will start getting frittered away.
One final question before we open the floor to others to ask you questions. Mm-hmm. And this one is on China. And as we know, there has been a lot of Chinese activity in our neighborhood. One of the major worries that India has had is that the Indian Ocean will soon become a place where there is increased Chinese presence, and thereby raising security concerns for India. Is that a legitimate concern? Because after all, what the Chinese are doing is based on their economic cooperation with the countries in South Asia in particular. And we saw that happening in Maldives, and of course that's one way of increasing the influence that they have in the region. Same thing has happened in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, etc. Many have called it the string of pearls. But is it something that India should be worried about? And is it something that India can do anything about?
Well, certainly not much we can do about it. And I'm not a big believer in the string of pearls theory, because I think that the string of pearls, the idea is that these are pearls around India's neck and they can squeeze the string tightly anytime they want to choke us. And I don't think that's at all a realistic way of looking at the maritime geopolitics of the issue. I mean, they have a port or a presence in Akyab, one in Hambantota, one perhaps in the Maldives, though right now they've lost it, one in Djibouti. I mean, you know, our neck is far too big and strong and muscular to be easily choked by this particular string of pearls. But the larger question I would ask you, Anil, is why must we start off with a zero-sum projection with China? I've often argued, for example, that keeping open the sea lanes of communication between the Gulf and East Africa on the one hand, and India and China on the other is actually could be a joint shared objective of both India and China. Because nothing can get to the Straits of Malacca and through to the South China Sea without going through our waters and through the Indian Ocean. So why do we see it purely in terms of competition? Why don't we actually encourage things like, for example, joint anti-piracy patrols with the Chinese? Show them they have nothing to fear from us, that we are interested very much in looking at where our common interests lie. We're not going to say that every single thing will be a common interest, but having the sea lanes of communication open, having piracy-free waters, permitting trade routes to function normally, that's of interest to us, that's of interest to China. The goods will come past India before they go to China, and some of them will stop off in India. So the Chinese should ultimately see the argument that we both have to benefit from allowing this to happen. Mind you, it's never happened. We've never had this dialogue, and we've never had any effort to create something like a joint maritime patrol with the Chinese, even when the Somali piracy was at its peak. And to my mind, these are things that, honestly, we could have well considered remedying.
Thank you. We have about 10 to 15 minutes now, and we will open the floor to questions. So please, if you can identify yourself and then ask the question. Keep it short.
By my clock, we're 20 minutes over time, but since the previous panel ran late, it's okay.
We start
stay
from
for
here.
Another 10. Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening, sir. My name is Anushka, and I'm a student at LSR. My question is, so while foreign policy is, thank you. While foreign policy is becoming increasingly important for India with the changing geostrategic imperatives, do you think that's the term strategy or the understanding of the phrase strategic affairs is really something our policy makers are they're aware of or they completely understand? I mean, why is there a lack of papers being published on concerns that are legitimate, that legitimately the country faces? And do you think we should also incentivize the processes that are undertaken by organizations like think tanks? That's what the question is.
Well, I mean,
Thank
you ask policymakers, you're talking about people in the Foreign Ministry, the Defense Ministry, the National Security Council, the Government of India. Those people obviously should have, whether they have it or not, it's a different debate, but they should have very much a geostrategic vision of what India is trying to do in the world and how to go that way. But when you ask why papers aren't being published, governments very rarely publish papers. This is the job of think tanks, academic institutions, journalists and observers. We've got some very fine journalists looking at foreign policy, in my view, some of whom straddle the ground between journalism and academia, like Raja Mohan, for example, who's sometimes in Singapore, sometimes here, writes on foreign policy. Someone like Jaishankar's son Dhruv, who's a young man, but who's got some very interesting ideas. Then some of the newspaper correspondents, Suhasini Haidar is very impressive. Pramit Pal Chaudhary used to be at the HT. These are people who got some in-depth idea of foreign policy. Indrani Bakshi at the Times of India. And these people then make sure that as reporters, they keep in touch with the thinking of people like Anil when he was in the ministry, so that their insights can be informed by some inside knowledge, which obviously will never be on the record. As I said, government will not publish its papers at all, with the exception of things like the Lok Sabha committee. I mean, it's not Lok Sabha, it's Lok and Rajya Sabha. The parliamentary committee reports on certain subjects, which are informed by the comments and suggestions made by the MEA, but nonetheless ultimately represent the point of view of those MPs who are thinking about these things. That kind of thing, yes, you can consider published. I still think, for example, that at least 3 of our reports, maybe 4, will really stand the test of time as solid documents going in depth into foreign policy. One is the India-China report, One is India-Pakistan report. One is our report on soft power and cultural diplomacy. And one is our report on the Indian Foreign Service. Its recruitment, its training, its deployment, its language, its resources, that whole thing which people find unglamorous to look at. It's pure administration and budget, but it's very important. So all of these things that they go on the Lok Sabha website, see the kinds of reports the committee has come up with in the past. And you'll be satisfied that there is material out there that addresses some of these issues. But don't underestimate our experts in the ministry because they haven't published papers. In fact, many of them, as you know, once they retire, they become absolutely gifted writers and analysts in the media. And that's partially because while they're inside the government, they have to be very, very careful about anything they say that could affect our relations with those countries. So they tend to be quiet until they retire.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sorry, may I come to you? May I come to you after the gentleman you asked for it first? You're next.
Prime Minister Modi got a very friendly or big hugs with almost every head of the state. And in return, he got a big hug from people of India. Except you're a lucky man, you got face saving. Don't you think the way he is getting popularity and doing a lot, and recently concluded G20, so he could prevail all these leaders, whether it was S-400 issue or Iran or any other issue. So he's quite having a benchmark, and future leader will be facing a trouble to face him.
But what has Mr. Modi done in the G20 that Dr. Manmohan Singh had not done before? In fact, Mr. Modi was made to stand in the second row of the photograph. Dr. Manmohan Singh was always in the first. And I might add that when it comes to stature, India, obviously, as I began by praising the energy that Mr. Modi brings to his conduct of foreign policy, India is a country to be reckoned with because of our size, our economic performance, our influence in the world. But we are also judged fairly harshly, for example, for being today a less successful economic story than we had been 5 to 10 years ago. We are being judged, unfortunately, for some of the domestic developments in this country, which have given us a very poor press. I mean, you know, when my friends in the BJP going around saying that we can hold our head high with Mr. Modi, I'm sorry, just pick up at random any Western newspaper for the last year or two, and the overwhelming tone of coverage about India is negative, unlike when UPA was in power. Because UPA was seen as enshrining pluralism, diversity. Dr. Manmohan Singh was universally respected. When President Obama was asked, can you name the 3 world leaders you're most impressed by? The first name he gave was Dr. Manmohan Singh. So it's a different era. Whereas with Mr. Modi, unfortunately, we get articles about cow vigilantism, about attacks on women, about intolerance, bigotry rising, all of this stuff. So don't think that we have done better in the perception of the world. I'm sorry to say we've actually done worse. It can be remedied. Just today I was addressing the National Defense College on soft power and why it was important for us to strengthen our soft power image in the world. The government, as I said, took some steps. I mentioned earlier the Yoga Day, the Buddhist Conference and so on, but in many areas it has failed to understand that domestic developments have a terrible impact on our soft power because they impinge the way in which we are perceived in foreign countries. So I'm not, I'm afraid, prepared to give any very high marks yet to the present government, though I understand your point.
Okay, next question here, and then after that there are 2 hands up there, one there and one at the back.
Good evening, Mr. Tharoor. My name is Veer Kaul. I have a question directed to, basically 2 questions intertwined and directed to you. As you rightly said, Mr. Modi's policy on Pakistan is completely not conclusive, not at all. And therefore, by virtue of that, are you not seeing a parallel between his not having no policy framework around Pakistan and Kashmir deteriorating at the same time? That's one. And second, did he want Jai Shankar as the foreign minister because he wants to be the chief foreign minister? These are 2 questions together, sir.
Well, I think on the second, it's been very clear, even in the first term, what Mr. Modi wanted in a foreign minister. He wasn't looking for somebody who would be jet-setting around the world, glad-handing other foreign ministers and taking policy initiatives. That was going to be his job. He wanted a safe pair of hands to manage things that he didn't find all that glamorous, such as running the ministry. And in the case of Sushma Swaraj, she developed a nice little niche in looking after overseas Indians having problems, or even Indians traveling abroad having problems. And that kind of thing, I'm sure Mr. Modi would be quite happy to leave to the foreign minister. But when it comes to the big ticket issues, foreign policy was made in the PMO, and I don't think that's going to change, except that in those days for 5 years, Mr. Jaishankar was de facto part of the PMO. He was somebody who was being consulted, who, unlike Sushma Swaraj, accompanied Mr. Modi on his travels. So it may be easier to resume that relationship in the new hat of foreign minister. But I think the nature and substance of the relationship will be identical to what it was when he was foreign secretary, which is a bit unusual, but that's because he's not an elected foreign minister. He's not somebody who's come with any popular mandate. His mandate comes from Mr. Modi, and Mr. Modi determines the limits of his role and influence. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that as a good, competent professional, Mr. Modi will be well served in terms of his own perspective of what he wants. He doesn't want a political foreign minister. On the first part of your question, look, again on India-Pakistan, the stand that the Standing Committee on External Affairs took is one that I would still commend to the present government, which is that we fully accept that you can't really rely on a civilian government in Pakistan because honestly they are incapable, it seems, or unwilling, one or the other, to challenge their own military and do anything that will actually help us in terms of either addressing the terrorist menace coming from their country or in terms of genuinely improving the depth of our relationship. But what we could do, since merely not talking is not a policy, and for the last couple of years that's the only policy we've had. So what we could do is try something unilateral where we don't need the relationship and cooperation of the other side, and that's to open up people-to-people contact. I've been urging this for some time. When people say, oh, but then terrorists will come in large numbers if you're too liberal with visas, I'll say, did any of the 2611 terrorists apply for visas? You know, those who are willing to come to the Indian High Commission and give their photos and their irises and their biometrics are not the ones who are going to be setting up bombs in India. And by and large, my experience is that every Pakistani who comes to this country goes away absolutely pro the relationship, very captivated by India, attracted by so many things where we are like them and different from them. All of these things would give us a larger constituency for good relations inside Pakistan than we have right now. Right now, it's so difficult to come to India. It's so difficult for a Pakistani to get a visa. You can't really do business easily with India. All of that means that very few people have any stake. Many people in Pakistan have any stake in the relationship with us. If tomorrow there's a terrorist attack and we take some sort of retaliatory action, it doesn't hurt anybody in Pakistan. Whereas if you follow what I'm recommending, we have a very detailed set of recommendations, open up the space for businesses, tourist visas, relatives, sports people, cinema people, musicians, cultural people, and so on. You create all that, you suddenly have a large number of people who have a vested interest in seeing that the boat is not rocked. So that it makes it, as long as these are influential segments of Pakistani society, it makes it that much more difficult for the military to unleash a Lashkar-e-Toiba or a Jaish-e-Mohammed upon us, knowing that it will be unpopular with their own people that this is being done. So that's a hope. Frankly, it may be a rather simple hope, and one which many will argue will be belied at the very next terrorist attack. But the truth is that we haven't tried it, really. We were in the process of beginning to try it when 2611 happened. Shah Mahmood Qureshi was in Delhi trying to negotiate a more liberal visa regime when that happened. But other than that brief window between 2003-4 and 2008, we really haven't attempted any serious warming of relations with Pakistan. I personally am of the view, as was Dr. Manmohan Singh, that you cannot indefinitely afford hostility with your nearest neighbor. Apart from everything else, if it could ever erupt into hot conflict, you're driving away your most necessary thing, which is investment in this country. Foreign investors don't like to invest in war zones. So peace is much more in your strategic interest than anybody else's, maybe more so than in Pakistan's. Because Pakistan, what sustains their hostility is the dominance of the military in that society, and the military's need to continue commanding a disproportionate share of that country's resources. They command a disproportionate share of Pakistan's resources by justifying it by keeping trouble alive on both sides and both borders. That's something else that Pakistan will have to deal with. There's not much we can do about it, other than to say that as long as they try any funny business with us, we'll give them back as good as we get. But in the meantime, those who are unconnected to terrorist activities, normal civilian citizens, we'll give them a welcome here and see how it goes. Unfortunately, the political emotionalism around every incident has actually narrowed that space even more than it used to be. And as you know, when Pakistani film actors acting here, suddenly they've been disinvited by all Bollywood producers because of, I think it was Pathankot and Nagrota that led to that decision. I mean, that kind of thing beyond the point is self-defeating. We are just foreclosing our own options to enlarge the space with Pakistan.
Okay, next is the gentleman in the white shirt there, please.
Evening, sir. My name is Chayan. I'm a student at Jindal School of International Affairs. My question being in follow-on to the point which you made in regards to the string of pearls and how it seems unrealistic as a threat for India. So if I follow on to the same and develop an argument, it has been acclaimed by many professionals in the field of international relations that how the multilateral order has been failing, and even the democratic order in the world has been failing, which was very well conceived by the delegation in Davos, the Chinese delegation in Davos as well. If I have to ask you that, when you say that India needs to focus on programs with China in regards to anti-piracy in the Indian Ocean and in regards to South China Sea as well, do you think the Chinese would be keen to it, considering how we were the one to reject a multilateral project, which was the BRI in?
Well, I think the Chinese, being extremely prickly sensitive themselves, they will understand fully why we rejected BRI. I mean, they're basically building a road through territory that even they acknowledge is disputed between India and Pakistan. We claim it's ours, Pakistan says it's theirs, China says it's disputed. But if it's disputed, you don't go and build a road there without consulting both parties to the dispute. So de facto, what they've done is something that no Indian government of any party would be able to tolerate. That's the first real objection to BRI. There is a second objection, which is that we believe that BRI in many ways is going to create a debt trap for the recipient countries. We've already seen it somewhat in Sri Lanka. They've had to surrender control of Hambantota for 99 years. They can't afford to service the debt that's been given to them. And so if you look around, I would argue that with the Chinese, we're in a position where there will be areas we can identify where we can cooperate with them, and there will be areas which they may be willing to cooperate with us on, but we have a heck of a lot of outstanding issues. On trade, for example, the terms of trade are practically colonial. They're the ones exporting massively to us, and what little they're taking, I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, the numbers are something like 62 billion exports from China to India and 19 billion from India to China. So it's not even comparable. And most of what we're sending is raw materials like iron ore and so on. And they're sending us finished goods. It's practically like the terms of trade with Britain before 1947. Why should we continue to subject ourselves to that when they're denying us market access in China to our products, when our pharmaceutical companies have not been able to make headway, when IT only makes headway when they can train Chinese and so on, but they're not allowed to expand? There are lots of frustrations. There are non-tariff barriers the Chinese have given us. That's a challenge we need to overcome. On the plus side, we can do much more in terms of tourism, in terms of studies. For example, there are 16,000 Indian students in China. There are practically no Chinese students in India. We can try and encourage cooperation, all that. There's no shortage of options to explore with the Chinese. But at bottom, there is a certain mistrust because we see that China has historically wanted to keep us in check, and has also wanted to use Pakistan in order to, shall we say, limit our progress and our ambitions in the region. So I don't see China as fundamentally friendly in orientation, but I do see China as a country we can work out a modus vivendi with where it suits us. And where it suits them too, it has to be win-win. But if they don't, then I don't see how we can possibly possibly go beyond that. I mean, it's not, the relationship is not as bad as, say, the relationship with Pakistan is, but it's not as warm as the relationship is with Russia or even with the US or many other countries.
Okay, the gentleman in the black t-shirt, please. We won't take any more questions beyond 2, which we already have on our list because Dr. Shashi Tharoor, so you are next.
Good evening. My name is Nimish Batra and I'm studying IR at Shiv Nada University. My question to you is, political biases aside, what do you think is a more apt response to a terrorist attack like Pulwama or Pathankot? The post 26/11 isolation that Manmohan Singh called for, or a direct strike on Pakistan land across the LOC?
No, I think the UPA's decision not to retaliate militarily, but to do so diplomatically, was a very well-considered decision. I think Shiv Shankar Menon has written about it in some detail. And the calculation was that you would actually gain more by putting diplomatic pressure on Pakistan, because attacking them would merely make them all rally behind the flag, and it would just be potentially a war. And in fact, it turned out in the short term to be the right decision, because as you know, under massive diplomatic pressure from Western countries and even the possibly unspoken threats, the Pakistanis arrested Zakir Rahman Lakhvi and 7 people and put them in jail initially and promised trials and so on, just in order to diffuse the pressure we were mounting. So it was effective in the short term. But in the longer term, it failed to be, and the Pakistanis have released Lakhvi and have released the others, and they're not doing anything about the trials they promised to conduct. So they're completely off the hook now. So Mr. Modi, in that sense, was right in saying, no point trying the same thing we tried earlier because it wasn't durable. We have to do something better. At the same time, it seems that one of the reasons that Balakot did not create a wider conflagration was because it did no real damage in Pakistan. That seems to be the consensus of observers, that we talked a good game about taking out 300 terrorists. My good friend, the Foreign Secretary, actually used that number, and I'm a bit embarrassed for him, because you can't really kill 300 people without 300 coffins showing up. And I am not aware of any of the various people who are diligently watching Pakistan, including on satellite technology and so on, having reported anything like this. So, my own gut instinct is that Balakot actually served Mr. Modi well politically, because it showed that we were taking a decisive action and attacking Pakistan, not just across the line of control, but across the international border. But it also worked for him because he didn't do any serious damage. If he had done the damage he claimed to have done, Pakistan would have felt obliged to retaliate. And that would have probably led to a spiral of escalation, which is what Dr. Manmohan Singh was trying to avoid back in 2008. So right now, we have the best of both worlds. We can go around saying, when I say we, I mean India, I don't mean my party, I mean the ruling party. The government of India can go around saying, we showed the Pakistanis what's what, we took decisive action. And in practice, the Pakistanis going around saying, well, they hit a few trees, fine, they're welcome to it, let's move on. And that kind of, and as you know, the one thing that actually came out of the aftermath of the Balakot strike was the capture of one of our pilots, the downing of one of our planes, and then the magnanimous release of that person by the Pakistanis in a way that made Pakistan look far more statesmanlike than we did.
Second last question over there, please.
Good evening, sir. I'm Shubham Sharma. I'm pursuing my MBA from New Delhi Institute of Management. My question is in regards to what Anil sir said about India juggling with one side US and Japan and other side China and Russia. So as we all know that Trump is in power and how an impulsive man he is. So my point is that during this S-400 deal with Russia, Mike Pompeo came and US made a very public comment that it will, if India continues with its deal, then it is going to ruin their ties with US, their business ties with US. But instead of doing anything about it, India went ahead with that. And now China has publicly asked India to join China and Russia regarding the trade wars. And at the same time, India is India has imposed tariffs on American goods, 28 American goods, American products. So my question is, what is the strategy behind this? Because it is not just possible that India is in any way thinking of having an upper hand with US. It's not possible. So what is the strategy behind this stand that India is taking right now?
I think the strategy is basically to show that we have our own ideas, that we may give in on some issues and other things we can't, and that we will stand our own ground when it really affects our vital interests. In the case of the SS-400 or whatever it's called, 440, this is, by all accounts, the experts tell me, a far better system than the one the Americans are offering us. And it suits our purpose as well, and there's interoperability with some stuff we got from the Russians, and the Russians have a training deal with us, etc. So we feel that this is too good a deal for us to pass by to satisfy the Americans, who will sell us an inferior missile defense system to the Russian one. So we're going to go ahead with that. Whereas on, say, Iranian oil, which Anil and I spoke about earlier, we had 23.5 million barrels to fix, but the Americans apparently lent on the Saudis to give us a little more supply than usual, and one or two others will have to compensate, even at discounted prices. So there's been some back and forth. I'll have to see at the end, because we haven't seen any official figures from the government. These are just media reports. It seems to me that India is saying to the Americans, look, we really value you. You are important to us. We have a congruence of views with you on many issues. But on some things, we do disagree. Now, you can get your way on Iranian oil. We can't give you what you want on the Russian missile defense system. You can get your way on trade tariffs, but we'll sock it back to you with our own trade tariffs. Because, you can't have a one-sided tariff war. You are affecting some 5-6 billion of our exports. So we'll try and affect comparable amount of yours, and we'll see. Now, the hope is that at some point, some of American domestic interests will say to Mr. Trump, you're hurting us too, because we're losing market share in India because of your tariff policy. So far, that hasn't happened, but it may mount. America is very much a land of lobbying and private sector getting into business negotiations with the government on foreign policy and so on. So it's possible that if we take a tough stand on some issues, that it may not just be that the Americans will suddenly affect our relationship. Imagine if the Americans really were to take a negative thing on the relationship. They lose the one country in Asia that's a huge democracy, that is a potential counterweight to China, that is in good equation with them, with the Japanese in the trilateral relationship, and with also the Australians in the quadrilateral relationship. They've got so many advantages in dealing with India. Why would they want to jeopardize all that? And then we can also do a bit of talking back to them. No? If they do threaten something far worse than what we've seen so far, then we can say, in that case, we're going to behave like this anyway, we may as well buy more Iranian oil. What do you think? Let's diplomacy is not only about smooth talking and smiling and being nice to people. Once in a while, you have to deliver some hard messages also. And I'd like to think that we have a diplomatic service that's quite capable of executing those instructions with some finesse. On the whole, our orientation is friendly and sympathetic to the US, and we make some allowances for the domestic constraints of any large democracy, but we also expect them to make some allowances for our constraints.
Last question is from the anchors. Do you have a question? Excuse me? Yeah.
So I'm a little starstruck. So my question is in two parts. The first part is, like you already spoke about Narendra Modi's personal relations with a lot of, all these national leaders. So while talking about personal relations, I want your opinion on how does it affect having a policy which is different from the views of an individual. For example, take for example the Pakistan policy of Narendra Modi. He tried to develop personal relations with Nawaz Sharif. There was this whole marriage thing that happened, going to his granddaughter's marriage, inviting him for, and when it didn't work out, it led to a complete stop of all diplomatic ties. So does having personal relations with national leaders allow for a nation to have a national policy which is for the nation and not influenced by the individual in any way? That's my first question. So if you could.
No, the answer is very simple. Frankly, Foreign policy cannot be conducted on the basis of personal likes and dislikes, or personal whims and fancies. Suddenly the Prime Minister says, let's go to Lahore for a wedding, which catches his entire foreign ministry by surprise. That kind of whimsical foreign policy is not serious foreign policy. Foreign policy has to be conducted with a very clear strategic vision of what you want globally and in a particular relationship. And thereafter, all this personal stuff and diplomacy and so on is atmospherics. It helps, you know, it's nice if the country you've decided you want good relations with has a president who really likes you. But it doesn't mean that merely because he likes you or you like him, that you sacrifice your national interests or your strategic vision. That's far more important.
Okay. And my second part of the question is about Russia. So while we're talking about Russia, strategically and historically speaking, our partner was always the Soviet Union. Since the Soviet Union's breakup, the partnership between Russia and India compared to the partnership between India and the Soviet Union, or for example, for that matter, India and the US, has been somewhat less, I would say. So do you genuinely feel that the Russians can act as a viable global partner for India, especially since, as a lot of people here was saying, there's a global trade war happening between India and China. There's the entire political environment in the world is in shambles, and it is a very good opportunity for India to, you know, actually lead and actually come out as a leader. So do you think a strategic partnership or a global partnership with Russians is actually that viable considering the historical relationship between us and the Russians?
Now, as I said, our strategy is one of multi-alignment. We need to be able to work with all three of them, Russia, China, and the US, and try not to let their bilateral relationship affect ours, either for the positive, that is Russia, China getting closer. We shouldn't be dragged into that vortex. Or America, Russia getting more estranged. We shouldn't be dragged into that either. We should try and manage to keep all these relationships going. Russia is of use to us in many ways. We certainly can't afford to alienate them. Large chunks of our defense equipment and supplies depend on parts from Russia and training and cooperation. I think we're going to have to be very sensible about the Russian relationship. But at the same time, we have to recognize there are some real concerns. Mr. Putin's image in the Western democracies is not exactly particularly flattering. And there's a perception that this is a state that, in some ways in Eastern Europe, has been seen by some as a rogue state. So we don't want to be tarnished by their decisions and their mistakes. So we have to walk a very delicate tightrope, which we are doing so far. I think on that one, so far we are, but as I said, that message from the Russians when they went and did their exercises in, military exercises in POK, that was a bit worrying, and I certainly hope that we have done everything we can to pull that back and get us back into the right wavelength with the Russians. People waiting more than an hour at my home office.
My question is, do you think our Prime Minister Modi will shy away from escalation in response to terror attacks? Because Modi's option turned more kinetic in nature.
No, as I said, the 2008 option was not available in 2018 because it had already been tried, worked in the short term and failed. So he needed to do something different, which is why I thought that the idea of actually showing some determination to attack, I initially thought he would do an airstrike on the Pakistan-occupied part of Kashmir rather than actually in the mainland of Pakistan. But the fact that he did that sent a very powerful signal. I have no problem with that. At the same time, you speak of an escalation. That's not a risk we can lightly consider. How far will you escalate? Suppose Pakistan had retaliated and hit our territory. Would we then have used bigger weapons and more targets? That's a slippery slope to war immediately. So don't use a word like escalation too lightly, because you're talking about a nuclear-armed adversary right next door. And it seems to me that the great danger of military retaliation is no